Hey folks, I'm Claire, VP of Engineering at Moo.com, and I've created a great track of speakers today to talk about the future of work. The last 18 months has changed lots of things for many of us, and the world of work will probably never be the same ever again. I'm joined today by our special guest, Craig Coburn, who will be sharing some of his own personal experiences to help you think about what your strategy is for the future of work. During this session, I will think about what problems you're currently facing and the things that you can control to overcome them. As we're talking, make some notes in your participation guide and share your thoughts in our Slack channel. So I'm going to hand over to Craig now to tell us a little bit more about himself and the problem that you're hoping to help our listeners solve today.
Hi, Claire, and welcome to all the delegates, and thank you. So a bit of background about myself. My name is Craig Coburn, and I'm based in Edinburgh, Scotland. That's the castle that's behind me. And I currently work as a freelance Agile coach, helping a variety of clients, typically in the banking sector, has been in the public sector. I actually started off my career, however, as a software engineer working in networking. And because of that, I had quite an early introduction to both distributed work with a company that was spread across multiple continents, but also remote working, because we were collaborating remotely and helping one another over great distances and using software to do so in the days before the web. So my background has been often involving networking and collaboration at a distance for quite a while.
Way before it was cool and trendy.
Well, yes. I mean, some companies set them up to be distributed, but we didn't really quite recognize it in the same way that we do now. I mean, in latterly, we've now got video conferencing and high-speed internet. We didn't have that then, although when I was working for back then digital, we did have, some tools that were quite advanced for their age. We had 100,000 people connected on the same network. We had instant messaging, which for the 1980s was quite a thing, as well as email, as well as the ability to kind of send as many messages as we wanted over the company internal network. At a time when on the internet, you paid for each email and by size. So it was quite an interesting place to work in the day. And then when I was made redundant from digital and wanted to keep that level of connectivity, I started to then do research in, well, how as an ordinary citizen can I have this level of connectivity? Now, coincidentally, that was about the same time that internet access became quite readily available to the general public with flat rate access. So I then collated that information and published it as Britain's first guide to getting online. And that was back in the mid-1992.
Oh, wow, so you've been a remote worker for quite some time then.
Yes, and following being made redundant from digital, I did a Master of Science degree at Napier University, and it was in object technology, which was the sort of new trend then. But as part of that, we also looked at human-computer interaction and the sorts of software that would support collaborative working, because again, that was a new thing then. Back then, it was called CSCW, Computer Supported Cooperative Working. And as part of the degree, I looked into new advances in email, which back in '93 was the capability to send attachments, which was quite a revolutionary thing then. We take it for granted now. And as part of that, the university that was actually doing most of the research there was Washington State University. So I went over to Seattle, having collaborated remotely with Seattle University from Napier University. So there was, again, a little bit of face-to-face there and traveling over there. But there's also a lot of collaboration at a distance over the tools that we had. So again, it's really just about, using the tools at your disposal for the best means possible. Remember,
what did you learn from some of those early experiences, Craig? Even with limited technology in place. Important things you learned.
The challenges then were a bit different. I mean, sending an email would sometimes take 2-3 days to get across. So you just needed to work that in and, keep the emails small and sort of prep them and maybe send and take account for time differences. So it was a lot more asynchronous then. We didn't quite have that level of synchronicity and people all collaborating all at the same time. But it was about like gathering the questions and asking questions. I mean, even back then, search engines were more asynchronous. There was no Google in the early 90s. But some of the early search engines were geared up for people that didn't have great internet access. And so you would send your query off by email, and then it would come back like a few minutes or a few hours later. So that was just the expectation of how things were working then.
How has that helped you in the modern day?
Well, yeah, so in the modern day, things have moved on a great deal. I mean, apart from that research I did in '93, I've also had practical experience of working for distributed companies. Since then, of course, I've seen the dot-com boom around about 2000, where it became much more normal for businesses to be not co-located with customers anymore. In the old high street days, the customer would go in and shop in a shop. Then look, the advent of Amazon and others, in particular the dot-com boom around 2000, it became normal for customers to not be in the shop and to shop online. And so what we're seeing now is the same sort of thing happening for offices that has already happened for much of online shopping. And it's about really taking what we've seen in the past and using that knowledge effectively. So building on that, what has happened to me is that in a number of roles, sort of 2016, 2017, 2018, I had 3 different roles, and they both involved an element of being on site and working from home. And that was my first sort of real experience of the home office as opposed to simply a distributed company. And for me, it really worked out because it cut down a lot on the amount of travel I needed to do, particularly the nights away. Based in Edinburgh, a lot of my work happened to be in London or elsewhere, and that meant getting up at 3 o'clock on a Monday morning, catching a 6 o'clock flight, 4 nights in a hotel, getting back late on a Friday. That was really bad for family life. It was also very costly. So I rapidly saw here's a lot of benefits to be had from being able to be effective at home as well. And crucially, because the companies were geared up for that, they had the tooling in place already. So they didn't have to do a big technology pivot. Now, very interestingly, these companies that were already geared up for that sort of thing were then prepared when we had unexpected emergencies like 2010, Icelandic volcano, no flights, or 2018, red weather alert in Edinburgh. We were snowed in. Companies kept on functioning because they're already geared up for flexibility. So it provided that extra capability that was very useful when in March last year we were all then suddenly remote.
So on a personal level, how have you, you mentioned a second ago around helping with your family life.
Yeah.
How has your experiences of distributed and remote working helped you with your family?
Well, what I've also seen actually, in addition to that, and being able to spend more time with my partner and less time away by myself in hotels, it's also made me much more aware of that working situation that many people have of trying to balance work with maybe young children. My kids are all grown up now, but people with young children were having to balance, going on site and then having a commute and then having to pick up the children from the childminder. And it made it very difficult to actually balance work and family life. In particular, what we tended to see is that in the days when we had more face-to-face meetups, it was very difficult if you had children to then go to them. And of course, as we see, these connections that you make at meetups are important not only for personal networks, but also for learning. And so it tended to create a slightly disadvantaged playing field for people that had family commitments. Whereas now, it's easier. You can just join those meetups wherever you are. You don't have to worry about childcare arrangements or anything else like that. And you can network not only with the same people that you could have done before, but also you can network with more people worldwide. So it's a great leveler. And the additional one is that, it was probably about 4 or 5 years ago, I was actually working with a person in a wheelchair. And I just had to think of all the logistical difficulties that these people have to encounter when getting around, just getting to work. I mean, I did some research in 2017 for an article on online working, and there was a number of things that played into that around disability, things like people with reduced immunity and catching illnesses. I mean, people catch coughs and colds all the time in offices, but if you've got reduced immunity, it can have an additional impact. And also sick leave. The people with, the ability to work from home were actually sick less often because they weren't catching illnesses. Or the people with, disabilities weren't struggling to get to work on transport that wasn't really geared up to be completely, disabled friendly. And of course, if you have significant disabilities, it's easier to just create the setup that works for you. and your equipment, rather than trying to figure out, get an employer to cater for that for you. You know best what's best for you, and it's your employer's responsibility to support that.
Yeah. Have you seen examples of companies that have adapted their working practices and policies to make a more diverse and equitable environment for people with disabilities, and in the context of remote and distributed working?
Well, this is an interesting one. It's people with disabilities, of which that's 20% of the population. It's not a small number. A lot of these people were actually asking for this flexibility before because it suited them, right? And employers were saying, "Oh no, we can't do that. It's not how we work," or "You're missing out on all this contact," or whatever reason. And then all of a sudden, we find, like, with March 2020 coming along and everybody's got to work remote, all of a sudden those things that were previously so difficult to provide were provided within a space of days or weeks. You go, how difficult was that really? And now what's happening is that remote working actually creates a much more level playing field. Not only does everybody get the chance to contribute equally, whether you're disabled or not, using the right equipment, but everybody on Zoom is the same size, right? It's not like your big executives got your big plush, expensive, impressive office. They're just the same size on your screen as everyone else. It really is a tremendous leveler. But from a disability point of view, disabled people have been really embracing this change and said, we've been asking for this for a long time, but it's been really difficult. Now, they are actually protected in law by the Equalities Act and employers needing to make reasonable adjustments. But they kept on saying, well, this isn't a reasonable adjustment, or we won't make it, and trying to kind of block it. But now that they've made these adjustments, the disabled people are now worried, or some of them are worried. I mean, obviously every disability is different, but many of them are now worried. We just don't want things to go back the way we were, because we're quite happy with this. Yeah, and it's not just the slightly more obvious disabilities, like people who are in wheelchairs. It's things like neurodiversity, because that's a big thing that we talk about in Agile circles too. And in neurodiversity, you've got to cater for people like who prefer quiet spaces, or appreciate more focus time, or actually just don't like a lot of unexplained change and like steadiness in their environment. Yeah, I was finding going into offices, it's like you wouldn't know where you were sitting day to day. And also, if you're not very good with people's names, people would be moving around. It'd be a little bit confusing as to who was sitting where, and you struggle with names. You've got to write it down and make a little map of who's sitting where in the office. And it's just extra cognitive load that you don't get online, because right now, everybody's got their name under their face, and it's like really plain and simple. You don't need to worry about what they're called, or where they're sitting, or where your desk's going to be, or how high your seat is, or is the mouse on the left or the right because the left-handed person used it before you, or none of that. It's just the way you want it to be. And so for many people, it's better. Now, I don't want to overgeneralize here. I do realize that for some people it's not, but this is the key. It's about not making sweeping generalizations about, oh, it's been really hard. It's been hard for some people. It's been good for some people. Some people that are sort of in the middle. It's about respecting the individual and the individual's circumstances and trying to get something that works for the individual. And remember, that individual is not the chief executive, right? The chief executive's got their own preferences. It's about the individual worker and what works best for them, because people are adults. They generally know what works best for them. So I just say, let people choose.
Well, I mean, what are your thoughts on, we've talked quite a lot here about an important aspect of individualism and the employee. What are your thoughts on striking the right balance with what the company may want and require as well? Lots of companies are proposing hybrid working scenarios. Some are even insisting that folks come back to the office the whole time for business reasons. How do we strike that balance?
Yeah, well, this is the thing, right? So we've had the be in the office time. That was up until March last year. Now, remember, remote working didn't start then. Remote working's actually been on the go for a long time. So you have that data up until March as to how effective were people in the office. I assume these managers were actually measuring that, right? It'd be a bit strange if they weren't, but well, maybe I jest.
Let's assume they were.
But let's assume that they were, right? So now we've also had around about a year and a half of remote working in a pandemic. Now, that's not normal remote working, right? You've got to cater for the fact that there was homeschooling going on, there was a lot of personal stress, family relatives might have been sick. There's a lot of other stuff happening as well. But you can objectively look at those two and go, what was working, what was not working, and try and form a picture. And I would hope that you would find that it's not uniform, that it's going to be different for different people. I completely accept that people maybe by themselves, feeling lonely or bad broadband, these people will really struggle. People with very limited space to create a home office, they really struggle too. But other people, people with long commutes or childcare commitments, for them it was better, right? So you've got to kind of look at it from an overall picture point of view, but also a corporate point of view. Now, there's a lot of evidence out there that says that actually remote workers are actually more productive and more effective. Maybe not 100% universally true, because clearly you've got some people that struggled with remote working, but it's about supporting people in the right way. And where there's potential advantages to be had is you don't have the stress of a commute, you don't have the cost of a commute, you don't have the stress of trying to get back for balancing childcare. You've got all these things too. So it really is going to be an individual circumstances. But I don't think that organisations should be making too many sweeping generalisations of we weren't very effective remotely, when generally the independent data says otherwise. With the caveat that you do have to respect people's individual circumstances. So I say that when you're going back, in organisations that are effectively forcing people back to the office, because remember, most people don't want to go back 5 days a week. That's clear. We see a big disconnect between what leaders are asking for and what the general workers are actually wanting. The leaders have a strong preference for presenteeism in the office, but the workers have a strong preference for flexibility. And this big disconnect is causing rather a surprising culture war. Now, we've always had bad leaders, but what I think has happened is that the pandemic has made the bad leaders more visible, and people are much more prepared to talk about them. I mean, just look at what's going on at Apple. They're forcing people back to what's probably the world's most expensive office, right? $1 billion office. And even they're struggling. I mean, they say, look at Apple's office, now look to yours. Back to Apple's office, back to yours. They've got a better office than you, and they're struggling. What do you think you're going to offer that's more attractive than them? And this is it. People know that they have worker power. Now, you don't really want to leave a great job, but the issue now is that with some companies offering 100% remote as an option if you want it, then the workforce is no longer as constrained by location as it once was. So if you happen to be in a location where there's only a few employers, and now you've got the option of those local employers or other ones that are further away but offering remote, it's a much more competitive landscape. So the whole sphere of work has now become much more fluid and competitive. And this works both ways, is that if you were in a more rural location, you've now got new work opening up to you without the prospect of having to relocate and take your kids out of school and find new places for them. But you've also got more rural employers that were offering those local rates, but are now having to attract from a national landscape. And they're finding that unless they offer national rates rather than local rates, they're struggling to attract people. Now, there's some talk going the other way of national employers offering local rates for people that move into localities. So it cuts both ways. But certainly what's happened is that a constraint has been removed in the employment market, and then therefore it's much more fluid. And so there's only so far an employer can really go. Now, of course, some people wouldn't want to move jobs, but some people do. And we're seeing this great resignation of a bit more churn in the market as people then settle much more on the places that suit them. Now, if you've got two employers in a similar line of work, it's only going to take one employer to say remote work available here, and suddenly they can draw from a much bigger pool of talent, including the company next door that's being restrictive. So these sorts of things will then play out in due course over the next few months or even years as people then realize what's genuinely important to them. And to be honest, I think most people value quality of life over going to an office and being stuck in a busy train twice a day.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see over the next few months how some, like you say, and years, the longer term picture, arguably be more more interested in whether some of the predictions on the great net resignation and movement in the marketplace, which is definitely happening right now. Mm-hmm. How long will it persist? It'll be interesting to see how it pans out.
Yeah, and of course, COP26 is coming up. We do have to consider the environment in everything that we do. And clearly, even if you are commuting by public transport, it's still consuming resources. It's still moving hundreds of tons of metal up and down railway lines and buses, whatever. It still has an environmental impact. There's less impact walking across your bedroom floor, right, or your living room floor, than there is, with all that public transport. So it's better for the CO2 emissions as well.
Yeah. And we touched a little bit a minute ago about organisational culture, how this mix of people working, mix of at home and in the office can have on a company culture. Maybe what are your thoughts on companies putting more emphasis on allowing more remote and distributed work?
Well, I think it's actually been very good in some ways for company culture. I mean, obviously there's certain things we've missed out on, like, the after-work drinks. You can't really have a virtual drink in the same way. But other things come up. I mean, I've seen lots of pets online, and it's just like that personal aspect.
I love seeing people's kids.
Or kids coming up with their homework or unexpected things happening. And it's just like, it feels a lot more personal. You're actually in somebody's personal space, which, it's sort of good and bad in some ways, but it sort of breaks down a lot about the barriers and the getting to know the person as a person a lot better. So, I think that workplace culture is as much about knowing the individual, and it's easier to know them when they're in an environment that they're comfortable in, rather than a sterile environment which is office cubicles and you've got to work harder. So we need to think carefully, because being online isn't just the same as being in person, but it's a different format. Things happen differently. It's a bit more asynchronous. People might need to take time out in the afternoon to pick up the kids from school. There's all these other things that are happening. And it's just about making it work and ensuring that we move slightly away from this presenteeism culture of Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, do your 40 hours, and much more about, here's the outcomes that we want from you, and we'll measure the outcomes rather than how many hours you're spent at your desk. Because let's face it, in Agile, it's outcomes that matter, not hours spent. It's about effectiveness. And it's that shift of mindset towards outcomes and daily collaboration and check-ins and ensuring people are supported and work is transparent. These things matter much more than hours clocked generally, and whether you're spying on your employees and whatever they're up to. It's like, you can tell people are not working, because if you're checking in every day and you've got a board and you're talking about what you're going to be doing, and you can see what's happening and if people are being effective, rather than passing their desk and seeing if they're sat at a desk.
Yeah. Right. Well, it's been fantastic talking to you today, Craig. We've covered a lot of different perspectives there, haven't we? Wonder if you could summarise up for our listeners some of the key takeaway messages for them to take home and think about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've been through a period of great change. It's been difficult. It's been challenging, but we've learned a lot too. And I don't think things will go back to the way that they were. The office as we knew it has gone. A lot of people will go back to the office, but it'll be quieter. It will be different. We'll need to get used to people being at home. Flexibility is more expected. And I think the biggest wins out of all of this, apart from the environmental impact, it's the shift of focus towards the employee, being more employee-centric. And we see more transparently who the best people leaders are. And hopefully we'll gravitate more towards them. And we're hopefully, I think, see a shift in organizational culture, which will happen. And some will be better at it than others. Some will be forward, some will be backward. A bit like digital transformation or agile transformation, everybody's going to go at their own pace. But I think that some going first and some being those role models will actually be the driver that people go, actually, this really matters, because if we don't change, we'll lose out. We'll lose out in the best people. We'll lose out in being the best workplace. It'll be struggle to be as effective as an organization. So we're seeing a lot of activity just now around the Great Resignation, but hopefully this will actually lead to a transformative effect of much more emphasis on great people-centric leadership, best places to work, and a much more focus on the individual and supporting them, rather than checking in, checking out, doing the hours, and everybody heads home. It's more inclusive, it's more diverse, and it's also better for the planet.
Yeah, exciting times ahead. Well, thanks so much for joining us. You've shared some great personal insights there and lots of thoughts that can help inspire all of us to help think about our own personal strategies as we all prepare for this new future of work. Before I close, I'd love to hear from each of our listeners, and if you want to share your own thoughts and reflections, please share them in Slack, and Craig and I shall be around to help respond to some of your thoughts or questions. So thanks again, and speak to you all again soon. Bye now.
Okay, thanks then. Bye.
Bye.